Classical mythologies have shaped the very world we live in.
Yeah, whatever. I don't have time for dense, dusty old books, Paul.
Great. Well, that's what podcasts are for.
Oh, good point.
Join me, Paul, as I teach my best friend and improv comedy partner, Sarah, all about mythology on Myth Understood.
Mythology is frequently explicit, obscene, violent, and bizarre, though, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to joke about and improvise along the way?
Yes.
Oh.
So come for the mythology and stay for the absurdity on Myth Understood.
Available now at mythunderstoodpodcast.com and your podcast platform of choice.
It's Myth Understood.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers, to another episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. We're so glad that you join us from wherever you do, and we hope that you have been streaming all of our episodes because each one has a unique story, a unique guest, and a unique aspect of the Shakespeare authorship question and Oxfordian theory. Today, my guest is Michael Dudley, and he is a professor at the University of Winnipeg. He has a bachelor's degree in theater arts and 2 master's degrees. One is in library studies and the other is in city planning, which brings a very interesting perspective to how he approaches the Shakespeare authorship question. He has a chapter in a recent publication that is called Teaching and Learning Practices for Academic Freedom. And Michael addresses what he calls the epistemic injustice of academic freedom that revolves around the Stratfordian Shakespeare theory. Michael, I'll let you explain it better because I probably just butchered it all to hell. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me on. So just a quick clarification. I'm a librarian at the University of Winnipeg. We are considered faculty, but I don't teach a course. I do a lot of library instruction for other faculty members in the disciplines that I'm responsible for, which are Indigenous studies, political science, history, and theater and film. So I have had the opportunity to do some presentations on the authorship question at the university for a third-year course in acting in the theater department. The professor was very welcoming to me. I've also presented to the university has a high school in it called the Collegiate, and I've presented on the authorship question to some English classes in the high school. So, and over the years, I've been there in this role since 2012. I've presented at some conferences. The research office has funded my travel to these conferences to present on the authorship question. So I feel I've gotten, a fair bit of support for my research into this academic taboo, which, I'm impressed about.
That's fantastic. I'm impressed with that as well because, we have several members and some of them have been guests on the program who work for various colleges or universities. And they feel that, some of them have expressed that they feel they're sort of the black sheep of the faculty, that they have colleagues that don't want to address it, don't want to talk about it. So I think it's incredible that that you've found that kind of support there in Winnipeg.
Yeah. Thank you. So yes, the chapter, the book actually comes out on the 23rd of November. So by the time this airs, the book will be out. And it's part of a series from the Higher Education and Teaching and Learning Association. This is the 34th volume, and it's from an academic publisher, Emerald Publishing. So this is a significant academic volume. And again, I proposed this chapter on how the authorship question is marginalized in the academy, and that this is an internal threat to academic freedom that most academics don't recognize. And they said, fantastic, write us a chapter. So again, I think we are making significant inroads in some ways. I think in my case, I think being a librarian, I do have a little more academic freedom to talk about the authorship question. I'm not in an English department. There's no, particular prescription against this in my field. So in that respect, I think, the more we have people in other disciplines, like Richard Wagaman, in the psychological sciences, writing in his journals, is a fantastic example of interdisciplinary approaches. Because as we all know, it's not, strictly speaking, a literary matter. It is historical, certainly. But my particular focus, being a librarian and a city planner by education, is that I'm looking at this as an epistemological problem, as an ideological problem, as an institutional problem. So I'm not an expert in literary interpretation. I love Shakespeare. I love reading Shakespeare. I studied and acted. We in my theater degree at the University of Victoria, our third year in the acting program was entirely Shakespeare.
Oh,
so we got really we got totally immersed in it. I got to play Hamlet.
Really?
For about 20 minutes. For about 20 minutes in a directing scene. I got to do the Act 3, Scene 1, To Be or Not to Be, and then the Get Thee to a Nunnery.
Sure. Great.
Scene.
Great
so
scene.
I mean so that really was it's so exciting. I never actually worked as an actor though. As you can tell, I've got a kind of a meandering career here, going into library science and city planning, and then back again. But getting back to my point then, is I've been fascinated with the authorship question since the late 80s. That I came out of this theater program and I was saying, we spent an entire year immersed in Shakespeare. And yeah, we had some conversations about, the Baconian ciphers, and we kind of laughed it off. But we were taught about, Shakespeare poaching deer, and Queen Elizabeth asking Shakespeare to write her a play about Falstaff in love. This mythology, and we never questioned it. And so a few years after I got out of school, I was realizing, in all that time, I never actually read a biography of Shakespeare. I'm going to go find one. And I was working in a public library at the time. And so I went to the shelves looking for a biography, and I found this big, thick, 800-page book called The Mysterious William Shakespeare, The Myth and the Reality by Charlton Ogburn Jr.
Uh-huh.
And I said, oh, great, here's that biography I should have read. And I took it home, and within pages, my mind was blown, because as we know, he spends the first half of the book demolishing the Stratfordian tradition and then introducing Oxford as the alternative author. And I was so excited by this. And at the same time, I really felt let down by my professors in the theater program, that they had never talked about this, that they'd never said there was any doubt about the authorship, that this was completely, off the radar and not part of the discussion. So, and I thought, how much more exciting would it have been if we had been able to talk about this? And so I spent many years reading but not getting much beyond that. And so in 2012, I actually been working at the University of Winnipeg since 2000 at the Institute of Urban Studies, doing urban research and policy analysis and so on. And then in 2012, I moved into my current role. And at the time, the position was called Indigenous and Urban Services, with a particular focus on working with Indigenous students. Winnipeg has a very significant urban Indigenous population, and so there's some great programming at our university, a real focus on decolonizing and indigenizing the curriculum. We have a required Indigenous course component, so every undergraduate has to take at least one course in Indigenous studies.
That's a very interesting policy of the school. I'll bet that's pretty unique.
Well, it was. I don't think it was quite the first, but in a major university, and it was quite groundbreaking. And it's being copied elsewhere at this point. But so what I was doing in 2012, getting into this new position, is I wanted to read the literature on decolonization, and that is, looking at the Western chauvinism about empire and the place of the West and European ways of knowing. And I was really struck as I started to read this literature that started talking about the genius of the West, the natural genius of European culture and of England in particular. And I was really struck by the similarity of the language about this natural genius. And I then started working on what would be my first of a number of papers, where I want to get at the epistemology of the authorship question. And this first paper, which was for Brief Chronicles, called By Nature Framed to Wear a Crown, decolonizing the Shakespeare authorship question, was saying, well, here's this ideology of English natural genius emerging at the same time as the Shakespeare mythology, and the British colonial education system spreading a love of Shakespeare around the world through their empire. And what relationship is there between this ideology of natural genius of Shakespeare and the natural genius of Britain and of the West? And that was my first exploration into saying, I don't have the expertise in literary analysis. I don't have access to, these archives in Italy, for example. I'm not going to be able to contribute to finding evidence for Oxford. But what I can do, I decided as a librarian and a city planner, is to get at the knowledge system itself, the foundation of the Stratford myth as an ideology.
Let me stop you for a second, because something just dawned on me that I find very interesting, and correct me if I'm not straight on this, but it sounds like what you're saying is the very idea of the Society of England, that there is this noble class, this royal class, these people who technically, by definition, are genetically superior to others because of the blood that runs in their veins.
And blessed by God.
Right. Yes. And ordained so by God above. You're saying that correlates with the whole idea of the genius of Shakespeare, except that I think Stratfordians would argue that one of the things that they love about this guy, Will Shakespeare from Stratford, is that he was a commoner and he wasn't one of those nobles, and he isn't blessed with that royal blood, but was touched by God above with this genius brain to write the greatest English literature of all time.
Right. Because, Shakespeare, bardolatry, it is a secular religion. And, going back centuries in the literature I was finding, where this use of blessed by nature, it's a secular way of saying blessed by God. We are talking essentially about a religious conception of genius, blessed by nature. And so that you can't argue against that, because natural genius in explaining everything explains nothing. And you can't contest it. You can't test it. There's no evidence for or against the gifts of nature. But the fact that he is that he's this national secular saint of England, I think there's a real strong relationship, which is why I was thinking that Shakespeare, we're not allowed in the Academy to theorize about him and not about our beliefs in him. That we're able to apply a post-colonial lens to literature, to performance. We can, there's a huge body of literature about post-colonial Shakespeare performance, around the world, and how cultures that were once colonized have subverted or, adapted Shakespeare in performance to tell their own cultural national stories.
Of course, certainly.
Which is fantastic. But we're not allowed in the Academy to turn that lens on the author himself or our own understandings. And that's what I was getting at with this paper.
Now, is that the paper that will be a part of this book that's coming out November 23rd?
No, sorry, I'm giving some background. This was published in Brief Chronicles back in 2014. So yeah, this has been kind of a long research program that I didn't start out to develop, but it seems to be a natural progression of getting at the epistemology of the Stratfordian myth. So what I'll talk about the chapter itself then. It's getting at the rhetoric, the Stratfordian rhetoric that marginalizes the authorship question and says that it's ridiculous, a conspiracy theory, like Holocaust denial, and all of that. And we've in post-Stratfordian, Oxfordian circles, we've talked about this a lot. Richard Wagaman wrote a great paper in 2012 on the psychopathology of Stratfordianism, where he identified that Stratfordians are envious of the fact that we've got this candidate who's so much more substantial than the Stratford man, that they have no recourse but ad hominem attacks of calling us, snobs and conspiracy theorists and so on.
Oh, I can't imagine. I mean, there's so many. There's just so many insults. And, I remember being in a high school debate class and the instructor saying, well, if you have to resort to insulting your opponent, then you've lost the debate. And I've always wondered why that isn't more clear to people who continue to adhere to these, staunch Stratfordians, when you see that they truly have been reduced to mudslinging in order to support their claim, while we continue to present further research, further evidence, and further connections between the works and the Earl of Oxford.
Yeah. What we're practicing as these scholars who are outside the mainstream is entirely consistent with sound scholarly practice. That we are the ones pursuing an open inquiry. That this Stratfordian Orthodox Academy is instead shut themselves off from that open inquiry and are sticking with this mythology, and it's completely contrary to what we should be doing in universities and what we should be teaching our students.
Absolutely agree with that. And I know that Rick Wagaman has also written some papers and made presentations helping from a psychological aspect and his expertise and field of study in trying to explain why it is that Stratfordians feel so threatened by the idea, just the very idea of opening the door to inquiry here and looking at the evidence from an objective position. And so many of them are just not capable of stepping back and detaching their emotions and just analyzing the facts before them. It's astounding.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I know. It's a fascinating phenomenon. So with this chapter, then I called it "With Swinish Phrase Soiling Their Edition."
Love it. Beautiful title.
Thanks. Yeah, that it's looking at the all this rhetoric, this anti the rhetoric that marginalizes us in terms of epistemic injustice and academic freedom as an internal threat to academic freedom. And so it uses this lens of virtue epistemology. So this is a branch of philosophy that looks at all of us as knowing agents. So it's not strictly speaking about our beliefs, but rather the ethics of our if we view our beliefs as infallible, or if we recognize with some scholarly humility, we may believe something is true, but we have to be willing to acknowledge that we ourselves may, be fallible, and that we're building on knowledge by other fallible human beings, and that we have to be open to other people's knowledge and to listen to them. And if you shut out these other voices, that if you don't read their work and incorporate it as a deliberate action, then that's a form of epistemic vice. And epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what we think we know. So if you are treating other knowing individuals and groups in that way, if you are isolating them, if you are stigmatizing them, you are committing epistemic vice, and you are committing epistemic oppression against those people. And of course, reading this framework, it's like, oh yeah, this is exactly what's going on in the academy and the culture with how we're being marginalized. So what is completely the core problem with this as a debate is that it's not allowed to be a debate in the academy. It's ignored, it's disregarded, and no evidence will be accepted by the hardcore Stratfordians. So what I've got here in this chapter is that I'm not looking at the evidence for and against the man from Stratford at all. What I'm doing is applying an external framework from library science to this rhetoric, which I think will be very difficult for Stratfordians to respond to, because it's not concerning their man, it's concerning their rhetoric. So the Association of College and Research Libraries back in 2000 came out with what they called Standards for Information Literacy. And in the library and education biz, information literacy is that an individual is information literate if they know what their information need is. They understand how to assess, evaluate information, and incorporate it into their research and writing, and to use that information ethically. And so that was what they came up with in 2000, was these standards with learning outcomes. But in 2015, they revised it. They threw all that out. The Association of College and Research Libraries came out with something they called the Framework for Information Literacy in Higher Education. And this is much more philosophical. And so there's 6 principles here. First of all, that authority is constructed and contextual. That what might be conventional wisdom in one time period might be overthrown. That authorities can be biased. That we have to look at the source of the information in terms of potential conflicts of interest. That information creation is a process, but it might result in different formats. It's not always a peer-reviewed article. And right now we've got knowledge production, podcasts like this one, for example, videos, oral history, all kinds of different formats. That information has value in our society, that some publications get massive support from the publishing industry and get purchased by libraries in their hundreds, while others are shut out of that institutional structure and have to resort to self-publishing and get purchased by very few libraries. And this is beginning to sound familiar, right? That research is a process of inquiry, and that if there are unanswered questions and gaps in our data, then we have to ask different questions. That scholarship is a conversation, that scholars need to talk to one another, that they can't shut out other researchers just because they disagree. And then the final one is that searching is a strategic exploration, that you have to read widely. You can't deliberately exclude content that you feel contradicts what you want to say.
Well, I say that quite often on this program, and also in conversations that I have with, colleagues and fellow artists. When we talk about the Shakespeare authorship question, one of the things that I promote regularly is you have to do the reading. You need to make yourself familiar with the Earl of Oxford. You need to make yourself familiar with Oxfordian theory. It's too easy and too lazy to say, no, you Oxfordians are a bunch of conspiracy theorists, and I'm sticking with my guy from Stratford. If you haven't actually read a book about the Earl of Oxford, if you haven't actually read a book about the detailed history of him and how his life is so connected to the works of Shakespeare, then sure, it's easy to dismiss him. And I think that that's one of the problems that we come up against with a lot of Stratfordians is, to some degree, they're just lazy. They don't want to actually read the other side to educate themselves on why it is we all feel and believe this is the truth.
Right. And that gets at the way, and the other body of theory I looked at is around the label conspiracy theory, that is a lazy way to stigmatize other people and their knowledge production. And what literature there is concerned in the authorship question when they do, like Shapiro's Contested Will, he was looking at why people believe this, like what are their psychological motivations, right? Rather than addressing the substance of their claims. And that's as far as most Stratfordians will go, is to say, oh, these conspiracy theorists, what are their motivations? They must be snobs. They must, have these other, and occasionally accusations of anti-Semitism. And the comparisons with Holocaust denial are really offensive and really disturbing. So with this framework, I then look at quotes, a lot from Wells and Edmondson's work of mischaracterizing authorship skeptics, and how, first of all, that they trumpet their own authority as unassailable, and that any kind of questioning of their authority, they characterize that sometimes as immoral, essentially, that it's just wrong and dangerous to question their authority in this matter because they extrapolate that it's a conspiracy theory that will undermine our understanding of history more generally.
Sounds like a fascist regime to me.
Well, yeah, and I call it out as illiberal, really, that even though in their writing they trumpet their work as championing freedom and democracy, I do see it as quite contrary, in fact. And the fact that they're connected so strongly with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, that they are not uninterested observers. They're not disinterested. And again, the ACRL framework helps us recognize this, that authorities can be biased and have conflicts of interest.
I would argue that most authorities are biased and most authorities have conflicts of interest. One of the things that is happening more and more in our world as we are more and more dependent on digital sources for information, including social media platforms that are controlled by major corporations, is that we tend to forget that those corporations make their money off of advertising dollars, and that their number one goal is to make sure that those advertising dollars continue to increase. And so even a news agency, a CNN, an MSNBC, a Fox News, whichever one you want to refer to, they are first and foremost entertainment companies that have a news angle to their entertainment platform in order to sell advertising. And anything that they present is going to be presented through that lens specifically, or they don't exist and they can't pay those multi-million-dollar salaries to those television personalities who feed us this information in order to keep us buying the products that are advertising on those corporate networks. And we tend to forget that sometimes, I think, and see them as trusted authorities without a bias or self-interest, and that thus we fall gullible to their sales pitches.
Yeah. And of course, social media, the algorithms are designed, to sell advertising, but that if we're angrier, we click more and we respond more strongly. So it is designed to create conflict. And that's another topic, but if with this framework, I think if we can then recognize the structures of knowledge production related to Shakespeare and the authorship question, I think the Stratfordian readers, and this is a mainstream scholarly publication, I hope this will change the conversation. I hope they won't be able to get away with this kind of rhetoric anymore, that others will be able to call them out for it, because this is a framework for recognizing scholarly soundness, what constitutes good research in the academy, both for students and faculty. And what I demonstrate here is that what they have been doing for so long is really profoundly unscholarly, even though that's what they accuse us of being.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's wonderful that you have this framework, this structure that is so widely accepted now from a place of, I hate to use the word authority, but from a place of authority, that you would hope that all academia would accept and follow the practices of as being the best practices of their industry. And I will call it an industry. And if you, through pointing this out and doing so not from a literature perspective and not even from a Shakespearean scholar perspective, but from the perspective of an expert in your field of library studies, which involves so much research, if this can help serve to neutralize that tactic, that ad hominem attack tactic, then it could possibly open the door to better discussion about this, which I think would cause, the beginnings of a wave of a giant shift in academia.
I would hope so. That's my hope for sure.
I have always wondered, and I'm not a professor. I've been a teacher in my lifetime before, mostly to, junior high and high school age students. But I've always wondered why it's such a big deal to ask questions. And that's one of the very themes of this program and has been for the 2 years that we've been producing podcast episodes. We, always encourage our audiences, keep asking questions. And I've never understood the resistance of those institutions of learning to the very notion that students should be questioning in order to learn.
Yes.
It blows my mind. I
know. And the dangers of not asking questions. The other orientation I bring to the authorship question, which may seem not intuitive, is my education in city planning. And library science is all about how information, what information is and how you structure it and how you make it accessible, and also recognizing the bias in those structures. But city planning is about knowledge production in terms of, the real world consequences of, assuming that we know what's best. And city planning went through a lot of soul searching later in the 20th century because of really disastrous decisions in the post-war era of massive public housing projects that became uninhabitable, and massive freeways that tore apart neighborhoods, that Jane Jacobs famously criticized in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. So for city planners, for the last number of decades, there's been a real focus on how do we know what we think we know? That making assumptions about being in a bubble where we are only listening to ourselves can have terrible real world consequences. And so we have to be very sure before we do something that's going to intervene in society and affect people's lives. We really have to know what is real and what is our own wishful thinking. And that involves dialogue. It involves listening to people. It involves creating an environment where we can ask questions and get a whole bunch of different answers from a whole bunch of different people. And so that orientation, again, it just seems like, that is what we should be doing in so many spheres. And the fact that in the Academy regarding Shakespeare, we are not going to be listening to whole swaths of people. We're not going to be asking questions. We're going to ignore gaps in our data and just say, oh, well, those records must have been lost. Or, oh, he must have been a lawyer's assistant. That kind of thing just should be completely unacceptable in a university setting. And it does have real world consequences, One of the things I point out in my chapter here on academic freedom is that it isn't just that the Orthodox Academy is restricting the academic freedom of anti-Stratfordians or Oxfordians, but rather they are also negatively affecting the academic freedom of anybody who cares about Shakespeare, including themselves. Because, and this is something that they talk about in the literature of virtue epistemology and epistemic oppression, is that those who engage in that kind of epistemic vice end up restricting their own knowledge, and because they're not asking the questions, they don't end up learning their own studies, their own research, their own wisdom is completely restrained or constrained rather. And when I look at libraries, when I look at the tens of thousands of volumes of books about Shakespeare, and the hundreds and hundreds of biographies, and I just think of that this has to represent one of the greatest misallocations of intellectual energy and time in basically the history of the world, of our species.
I never thought of it that way or looked at it that way, but that makes so much sense. I think you're onto something there, because we all know, and we say this over and over again, if you put down on paper the actual facts that we know about Will Shakespeare of Stratford, it's 2 or 3 pages. That's it. There's nothing more to it. And when you find these tomes about his quote unquote life and what he must have done and where he may have been and where he might have picked up this information or this learning or this schooling, it totally is. And I love the way you phrased that, misallocation of intellectual time and energy. Excellent.
It's tragic. Yeah, thank you. No, it's a real tragedy. And the fact that for 100 years now, we have had an alternative. If 100 years ago, the Academy had said, okay, this is answering a lot of of unanswered questions. The sonnet suddenly makes sense now. If we had a whole century where this had been integrated into curriculum and scholarship and journals and conferences, I just can't imagine. I'd love to see what that alternative world looks like. But the fact that this has been suppressed, that scholars have buried their doubts, that they've continued to write these, well, I basically, the kind of biographies, they're fan fiction, really. That when you read these must have, should have, we can imagine him, doing these things. It's, it is.
They're like giant graphic novels about a superhero character that these writers and their audiences have cleaved to. In my home office, I have, of course, my library of Shakespeare volumes and more complete works than anybody should probably own, at least a dozen different versions, all of my Oxfordian literature. And then, of course, there are gifts and things that people have given me throughout my life because they know my love for Shakespeare, including I have a stuffed Shakespeare doll that looks like the man from Stratford here. And I have this action figure that is the William Shakespeare action figure superhero doll, comes complete with quill and book as his superpowers,
I've seen that.
And I love that piece particularly because I think it really sums up exactly what has been created here is this mythological superhero that people, as you say, have, created this mass amount of fan fiction about that cannot be corroborated and cannot be substantiated, and it's as if Stan Lee created Shakespeare.
That is a really good way to put it. Yeah,
there needs to be a comic book, the Hulk versus Shakespeare, or maybe Shakespeare joins the Fantastic Four. I don't know, but it isn't that far off.
No, it isn't, and that's the power of natural genius. It's a completely inexplicable superpower.
Maybe you have found a little chunk of kryptonite that is going to help weaken this caped crusader of academia.
Yeah. Thank you. I really hope so.
I'm curious though about what you think the future of Shakespeare studies is going to look like. More and more, and maybe and you have some insight because you're there at a major university, but more and more I'm finding that Shakespeare is being eliminated from curriculum. More and more universities no longer have a course specifically in Shakespeare. More theater programs are turning away from Shakespeare performance. They're starting to kind of wipe it clean of the halls of academia, and that concerns me in a big way. Is that happening there in Winnipeg too?
When you look at what the curriculum used to be like, decades ago, certainly there were more courses on the books. But this is the other, unintended real world consequence, I think, of the Stratford myth is that it is completely counterproductive to the academic, to scholarship, and young people can't relate to this marble, this god basically, and I think that that if we were able to incorporate the authorship question and Oxford's life into the study of Shakespeare, into the curriculum, that would completely invigorate Shakespeare studies. But I'm afraid that if we're not able to do this, and I think we're at a kind of a critical juncture in many ways regarding the authorship question, just because the world has gotten so unstable with the global pandemic, with climate change, and And when you look at these global threats like that, some may say that what does it really matter who wrote the plays? And there's so many answers to that. That it matters because truth matters, and because our understanding of this literature, which is so important to the world, would undergo a transformed understanding. But that also it just, what's going on right now just represents such a failure of scholarship that if we were to recognize that at an institutional level, I think it would help us in other fields as well to say, look, this is what happens in any field when it gets so ossified that we stop asking questions, that we get locked into our paradigms and we shut out alternative ways of knowing. That we are a global multicultural civilization, and there are so many other ways of knowing out there that can only enrich studies in so many different disciplines, this being one of them. But I think, that if we continue down this path, we are going to see Shakespeare gradually being whittled away.
Well, I have a friend who suggested that this is actually good for the Shakespeare authorship question, and it's actually good for the Oxfordian position that Shakespeare as a text, as a realm of literature and performance, is declining, because those who are in positions of power and authority, who have an affinity for the works and for the texts, are going to have no choice but to embrace the authorship question as a means to reintroduce Shakespeare to a new generation. How do you feel about that theory?
Well, I think there'd have to be a lot of, foundational, ideological, institutional, epistemological deconstruction, to use another, academic term there, before they'd be willing to do that. I think those who are really invested in this and refuse to question it, are not going to give it up lightly. Even if they saw that as a means to an end, I'm not sure that they could bring themselves to do it. A lot of the
Shakespeare festivals around the country, and I live in Southern Oregon, very close to Ashland, and Ashland, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, is arguably the most popular or most famous Shakespeare festival in the nation. I'm sure people in Utah and Montgomery, Alabama, and Hudson River, which are all three very important Shakespeare festivals as well, I'm sure they would argue that no, theirs are just as prominent. But that argument aside, nonetheless, many of these Shakespeare festivals and Shakespeare producing organizations have begun to turn slowly away from the origins of their festivals. Many of them now have seasons that include more contemporary plays, new works, and Broadway musicals than they actually do include the works of Shakespeare. And I'm certain that part of that is because of ticket sales. And again, as we mentioned, everything when it comes down to it's about making money in some way or another. And obviously they can't survive if they're not selling tickets and putting butts in seats. And with what has happened with the shutdowns that have occurred and theaters being closed, especially for as long as they now have been, and we hope soon we can get reopened in that way to full audience capacities for these theaters, it will be curious to see how much of their programming still includes the works of Shakespeare. And I would argue, and I have proposed, that I believe that the Shakespeare festivals and Shakespearean theatrical producers who embrace the authorship question will find that they now have a new means by which to intrigue their audiences to come to see the plays, more so with this new layer of interest. Because I think, imagine if you would, that I'm a major Shakespeare festival and I'm putting on the 20th production of Hamlet in the history of our organization. Only this time, with in addition to the performances, we're offering pre-performance symposiums or post-performance discussions with the directors and the actors that involve this issue, this question, the Shakespeare authorship question. I think you might find audiences newly intrigued by these very old works because of this new layer of interest that you could place on them.
Oh, yeah, that'd be fantastic.
I would love to just see at least one major Shakespeare festival try it. And I know that there are plenty of us here in the Southern Oregon area who have tangential contacts with the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. And I would love the opportunity to sit down with some of their administrators and say, just give it a try with one play, one season. Open up some discussion, open up some pre-performance presentations. Let some of us who know how this play particularly connects to Edward de Vere's life, share that with your audiences so that then when they go in and watch the play, they can look for those moments that we've talked about and let their light bulbs turn on and see what it does for your ticket sales.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Wouldn't it? I'm going to push for that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, that's fantastic. The thing that you say about the light bulb, the other thing that gives me hope is the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship's How I Became an Oxfordian series. All those essays are just so inspiring and just demonstrate how transformative it can be for an individual to make that shift from the myth to this new understanding of a real human being behind the works. And that was another paper that I wrote. Have you read or seen the video that I did?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So that was a really exciting project to do as well, because just parsing out all of these statements that people had written and how it portrays that shift of a paradigm, that if more in the academy could see that shift is so powerful and energizing and inspiring and gets people totally engaged, I think that would help as well. That it isn't just a set of competing facts, but that it has these real world consequences for us.
Nearly every one of our guests on this program have at least touched to some degree, and even you did earlier in this episode. You talked about coming across Charlton Ogburn's book. And just about every single guest has mentioned to some degree how it was that they first discovered this or how they first were intrigued by it. And one of the common threads that I find, and I encourage our listeners, if they haven't already, to go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website and to find the How I Became an Oxfordian series and look through and see the diversity of backgrounds and professions and reasons and ways that people came to be a part of this organization and a part of this movement. I think it's that in itself is so intriguing to just look across and go, wow, for everything from, professors of psychology to doctors, to lawyers, to theater producers, librarians, you name it, plumbers, electricians, everybody's there,
I mean, that when I did my paper on that, there were only 50 essays at the time. And of them, I think there was only one or two that were, traditional English literature backgrounds. But yeah, all the diversity of backgrounds was quite striking.
It's incredible. And the one thing that I would say that laces us all together, and certainly and it's not one book or another or one theory or another, but I would say that what truly has drawn us all to this is a humanistic level to it.
Yes.
Is that we all not only have passion for the works, but we now all have passion for the man who created them, because we can clearly see his life painted on the page.
Yeah.
And I think that, many people have been able to watch the Frontline episode where Charlton Ogburn was actually interviewed. And it's such a striking moment in that episode. I believe you can find it online. I believe there's a YouTube version available or a Vimeo version available. And
he gets all choked up.
He does. He starts to well up with tears. And when I first saw that and watched that, I was similarly moved at the same time, because I realized that he was expressing exactly how I felt about it as well. That there has been this horrible injustice committed, and that this man's life and works deserve to be recognized properly, and that it's shameful that it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. And that also gets back to the fate of Shakespeare in the academy and in high schools, is that there isn't a person that young people can relate to. There is no there, right? And when I was looking at these essays and just realizing there's all this empathy that people are expressing, they finally see the author and they can relate to his struggles and his suffering and his own recognition of how his name was going to be lost to history and how tragic that was. That is completely absent in the Stratford myth, and I think that again is a huge tragedy and a missed opportunity that is going to it is going to, if it continues, continue to erode Shakespeare's place in our culture.
I would even argue that in today's day and age, that iconic image, that image that they have made stuffed dolls and mouse pads and T-shirts and coffee cups out of, that bald-headed Droschet engraving image, I would argue that image is also counterproductive to a new generation finding interest in the works of Shakespeare. I think that image alienates the youth of today from even wanting to know more about this man.
Right.
But if you show them a picture of any of the paintings of Edward de Vere, that there's a much more intriguing character there that is far more appealing to young people today to want to know more about that man.
Right. And you know what I find so fascinating about, the rhetoric, the Stratfordian rhetoric, is when they call us snobs and they say, oh, you're saying only an aristocrat can have genius. Well, it's much more democratic to say that anyone can be a genius. And of course, that's not what we're saying at all. We're well, but actually, in matter of fact, as you said, it's alienating, because if this person was so uniquely gifted by nature, i.e. God, to write the works, and that is completely unattainable, no young person could ever say, oh, I'm not going to have this miraculous genius, or I don't have it, so I can't achieve anything like that. But if young people say, oh, here's this young man who had this wonderful innate talent, but it was nurtured, and he happened to be situated in society in such a place where he had access to the greatest libraries, where he had access to tutors, where he was part of a milieu that made sense, then you understand that we're all situated knowers and creators, and we can write what we know. I think that's much more inspiring for young people than this godlike myth. I think they've got it completely backwards.
I absolutely agree. And I, gave a recent presentation at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Online Symposium, which is available on our YouTube channel if you haven't seen it, or for anyone listening who would like to
I haven't
see
seen it yet, but that sounds intriguing.
But I gave a presentation about the mentors that help to foster genius, and painted out the examples of the mentors who helped shape the life and musical career of Mozart, the mentors who helped shape the life and physical science career of Einstein, and the mentors who helped shape the life and literary career of Edward de Vere. And the list can go on and on and on and on. And I think when you look at those three lives, and many, many more, there is such great, I don't want to say hope, because, hope was the last thing that escaped Pandora's box, but there is some great inspiration available there for young minds to look at that and realize that part of the success in life is having the right mentors in your life, having the right guidance from people who recognize your abilities and help to encourage and foster those abilities. Here's the greatest example of all time. When Philip of Macedonia needed a tutor for his son, who did he get? Just any slouch that he could find? No, he went and found Aristotle and said, please teach my son Alexander. And then Alexander went on to conquer the known world. If that's not the most perfect example of a great mentor, I have no idea if there is a better one than that. But there in itself is what is my point is, would Alexander, whatever his innate abilities happen to be, would he have been so successful by the age of 19 if it hadn't been that his personal mentor was one of the greatest teachers of all time?
Yeah. And the theory I'm referring to in this chapter, virtue epistemology, that is one of the principles of it, is that the circumstances in which we come to be knowers, that the opportunities to learn, knowledge or skills depends on all these environmental considerations. It's not possible to innately know foreign languages, for example, and the law and so on. And so I was struck by that too, that here's this recognized principle in the philosophy of knowledge that, again, the Stratfordian Academy completely ignores and or doesn't recognize that it contradicts their foundation for their guy. That he as a situated knower, it was not possible for him to have known the things that came out in the works.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a fascinating aspect of this issue, and I'm so thrilled that you're bringing this different approach to it from your expertise and your fields of study, and using the framework, as you called it, of addressing this epistemology. It's a hard word for me, by the way. And please tell us again, as we wrap up, the title of the chapter that you contributed, the publication, and where some of our listeners may find it if they're interested in reading it, if only to better broaden their understanding of what we're up against, but if not, also to maybe provide them some ammunition against Stratfordians that they deal with, to neutralize those ad hominem attack tactics that we see so often.
Right. Yeah, it's the chapter is called With Swinish Phrase, Soiling Their Edition, Epistemic Injustice, Academic Freedom, and the Shakespeare Authorship Question. And it's in the book. The book is Teaching and Learning Practices for Academic Freedom, edited by Enakshi Sengupta and Patrick Blessinger from Emerald Publishing. And it comes out on Monday, November 23rd.
and it is going to hopefully open the minds and eyes of colleagues across the world who are involved in true pursuit of academic freedom, and hopefully the true encouragement of academic freedom, as well as the freedom of their own students to continue to ask questions about all topics, about all things, because that is the only way we can continue to learn, not only as individuals, but as a society as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, thank you, Michael. Appreciate you coming on the program. And we would like to remind our listeners to visit the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. It is your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. If you haven't already gone to the site and explored the myriad of available resources there, please do so. Don't forget, if you have an ability to give us a rate or a review from wherever you stream this series, we would love for you to write out your comments, give us a few stars if you feel that we are warranted of such. Contact us. Let us know if there are episodes that you would like us to revisit, guests you would like to hear again, any type of comments or feedback that you have, please contact us through dragonwagonradio.com, dragonwagonradio.com. We are a proud member of the Dragon Wagon Radio Network. And if you haven't explored the various other podcast series that are available through the network, you should do that. You might find something else interesting to download or to stream for yourself while you do that morning jog, you drive that commute to work, or while you're locked down for pandemic reasons and just need to escape some of the outside world for a little while. You'll find some wonderful podcast series there, some of them very informative, some of them very entertaining. So please be sure to explore dragonwagonradio.com. If you haven't already purchased some Don't Quill the Messenger merchandise, you can find that at Dragon Wagon Radio as well. Go to the Dragon Wagon Radio shop. You'll find some wonderful merchandise there that helps support the program, as well as becomes a fantastic source of conversation. In fact, one of the newest items, and I just ordered a couple for myself, not only for me, but also to give as gifts, we have Don't Quill the Messenger face coverings, which I believe is so apropos because it has that iconic image of our logo, which is Edward de Vere peering out from behind the mask of the Stratfordian man. So you can wear your mask, which is a mask of a mask.
Fantastic.
Go figure. So if you haven't gone and explored there, please do that. We want to thank our guest, Michael Dudley, for having joined us today on this episode. Please be sure to stream all the other episodes. And Michael, we want you to remind our listeners, what is the theme?
Let's ask some questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.